When I tried to protect the truth, my sister defended a criminal and my family asked me to help cover it up, and then When I was 21, my sister Julia told me I was an embarrassment to the family. She didn't yell or throw a tantrum because that wasn't her way of doing things at all. She just looked at me across the kitchen table and said it like it was a fact written somewhere official. "You're making things harder than they have to be, Rachel. It's exhausting for all of us." She was in law school at the time, already carrying herself like every courtroom would bend for her the moment she arrived. Meanwhile, I was balancing two jobs between a diner and a hardware store while barely staying afloat in my psychology classes. I was always the one noticing what everyone else ignored, like the way Dad's office door never quite closed when it was supposed to. I'd sit awake some nights thinking about the things I saw there, the files he left out, the names stamped across pages he assumed I couldn't possibly understand. One night, I came across a file that I couldn't forget even if I tried. It linked one of the private security contractors Dad used to work with to a string of incidents that were quietly buried beneath layers of red tape and forgotten paperwork. I didn't storm into the room waving evidence or accuse him over dinner like a soap opera daughter. I just filed a report through the official channels, the way they tell you to when you believe the system can fix what's broken. A week after that, I came home to find my apartment keys no longer fit the locks. My backpack and a trash bag of clothes sat on the front step, damp from the lawn sprinkler, like they'd been there long enough for someone to stop pretending they cared. My mother stood behind the living room window, her face hidden by the curtain, though I could see her shape through the fabric. She didn't come to the door when I knocked, but my phone buzzed a minute later with her message. "This is what happens when you overstep, Rachel." I sat on the porch steps and stared at the street until the sun set behind the houses across the way. I thought about calling someone, but no name came to mind that wouldn't tell me to fix what I broke or beg forgiveness for doing what I thought was right. By midnight, I had made up my mind without saying a word out loud. I took the cash I had in my pocket, grabbed my books, and walked to the station downtown. The bus out of Phoenix rolled away at 3:12 a.m., and I watched the city I used to think was home shrink behind me until all that was left were lights fading into the desert. I didn't cry, and I didn't look back because there wasn't anything left there for me. By dawn, I had chosen a new name, not because I needed to run from who I was, but because I needed to build something no one could tear down again. I became Shada, the woman at the day labor office 2 towns over. Just enough name to work the warehouses and laundromats, not enough to trace. I slept where it was safe, on the floors of shelters when there was space, in corners of late-night diners that didn't ask questions, behind crates at shipping docks where the air smelled like salt and steel. Every dollar I earned went to night classes at a small community college near Salem where no one cared about my past, only my scores. I passed every exam like it mattered more than air. One night, a man named Grant left a card at the front desk where I picked up temp work. There was no title, just a government phone number and a note written in black ink that said, "You did the right thing. Let's talk." I didn't call him for weeks because I didn't trust the idea that someone might actually mean that. But the card stayed in my pocket like a weight I couldn't shake. When I finally dialed, his voice was steady, almost like he'd been expecting me all along. "We've been watching you," he said. "Not in the way that should scare you. In the way that means you belong somewhere better." The next thing I knew, I was on a bus heading north, my backpack heavier with everything I didn't want to forget but couldn't afford to carry anymore. In a Greyhound station bathroom outside Portland, I cut off my hair with a pair of dull scissors I bought at a gas station. The long brown strands fell into the sink like pieces of a story that wasn't mine anymore. I stared at my reflection until I didn't recognize the girl looking back. I didn't cry. I just kept cutting. When I reached the training site outside Boise, I wasn't special, and I didn't want to be. I wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but I was the one no one noticed, and that became my armor. I learned to track shadows and erase footprints, to read faces before they spoke and speak only when it counted. My instructors said nothing about my past, and I offered no pieces of it for them to use. By the time the program ended, I wasn't top of the class or bottom either. I was exactly where I needed to be, forgettable on paper and invisible in a crowd. They sent me to field assignments where no one else wanted to go, places where the work was ugly and the nights were long. I traced dirty money through accounts that should have been impossible to follow, flagged visas that didn't match faces, sat through meetings where men in press suits tried to convince me the crimes I tracked weren't really crimes at all. Years blurred together in cities where my name changed as often as my address. I answered to Shay in one place, to Lena in another, always careful, always silent. I didn't think about Phoenix or Julia or the house with its brittle front yard. I didn't want to. Until one night, in a quiet office lit by the blue glow of a computer screen, I saw her name where it didn't belong, and everything I'd worked to forget came rushing back like it had never left. The first time I saw Julia's name on a case file, I stared at it so long I forgot how to blink. It wasn't a mistake or a coincidence because I knew that signature better than I knew my own. She was listed as defense counsel for a client whose money I'd been tracking for nearly a year, a man who hid behind shell companies and false addresses, too clean to catch the way most of them were. I closed the file, opened it again, hoping maybe my mind had played a trick on me in the quiet of the night, but the name stayed right where it was, bold and undeniable on the screen. I didn't tell my supervisor that night or the next because I needed time to think. Instead, I flagged the case under a code meant for conflicts too messy to explain in a single sentence. I told myself it was the smart move, the right thing to do, but the truth was simpler than that. I needed to see for myself how far she had gone from the sister who once shared secrets with me in a room with walls thin enough to carry whispers. The hearing was in a small federal courtroom tucked behind a stone building that looked more like a museum than a place where lives got dismantled piece by piece. I didn't wear my badge because I didn't want it. I didn't want authority, only the space to see what I couldn't unsee. I found a seat in the back row, coat buttoned high, hair tucked behind my ears, just another silent body in the gallery. The judge read the motion like she'd done it 100 times before. The clerk shuffled papers. The bailiff checked his watch. No one noticed me, not at first. Julia sat at the defense table, her hair slicked back, her jacket tailored sharp at the shoulders, flipping through a binder like the outcome was already decided. Her client sat beside her, the kind of man who could blend into any boardroom or gala, clean-shaven, polished, eyes hard as glass. I recognized him from the files, the accounts I'd traced from one front to another, always stopping short of proof strong enough to shatter his shield. Then the judge's gaze swept the room, pausing at the sight of me. Is that Agent Shay Vale in the back row? Her voice wasn't loud, but it cracked the quiet like thunder across an empty field. Julia turned, slow at first, then faster as recognition hit. Her face went pale beneath the makeup meant to make her look untouchable. I watched her jaw clench, the small twitch of her fingers as she gripped the edge of the table. Our mother sat 2 rows ahead, a rosary tangled between her fingers, knuckles white, shoulders stiff. She didn't turn at first, but when she did, her eyes found mine and didn't let go. The hearing moved on like nothing happened, motions argued, evidence questioned, the usual dance of legal chess. But the air felt thicker, the tension a weight pressing down on every word spoken. When it ended, I stood, nodded once to the clerk out of habit more than courtesy, and walked out through the same door I came in. I didn't wait around. I didn't look back. I wasn't there to fix anything. I was there to be seen, and that was enough. 3 days later, the message came through a cousin I hadn't heard from since the night I left Phoenix with nothing but a backpack and a name that wasn't mine. She wrote like we'd spoken yesterday, like nothing had cracked and splintered between us. Just dinner, just family, she said. I said yes not because I believed the offer was clean, but because I needed to see the price they thought I might pay to belong again. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the yard patchy and dry, the paint on the porch chipped in places no one had bothered to fix. My mother opened the door, arms outstretched too slow to seem honest, eyes red at the edges like she'd been crying or wanted me to think she had. My father stood behind her, tie loosened, shirt sleeves rolled, face unreadable. Julia sat at the table, her wine untouched, staring at nothing like she could will the night to end before it began. Dinner was polite in the way people are when they're trying not to say what they really mean. They asked if my work kept me busy, if the weather where I lived was colder than they remembered, if I planned to stay long. I answered with nods and small words that filled the space without giving anything away. The enchiladas tasted the same as always, but the silence between us tasted like ash. Halfway through a story about a neighbor's promotion, my mother cleared her throat, napkin twisted tight between her hands. We were wondering, she said, if maybe you might know someone who could take another look at the case. Just a conversation, my father added, like I didn't know exactly what that meant. I set my glass down slow enough that they couldn't miss the sound. If I weren't with the agency, would I even be sitting here tonight? The room froze, answers unspoken because they weren't ready to admit the truth out loud. I folded my napkin, stood without raising my voice or my hand, and left the table the way I left that city years ago. This time, I didn't need to look back to know I wasn't the one walking away empty. The weight I carried didn't come from leaving. It came from knowing I should have done it sooner. The storm didn't come all at once the way I always imagined it might. It started small, a flicker in the corner of a screen. A video clip I hadn't known still existed surfacing where I least expected it. There I was at 19, drunk in a backyard I barely remembered, laughing too loud at a joke I couldn't recall, vulnerable in a way that wasn't meant for strangers. The man who recorded it had once sworn he deleted it after I left him behind, but I should have known better. I should have known that some people keep their weapons close for when they need them most. The headlines came fast and sharp, each one worse than the last, calling me reckless, compromised, unfit for the work I'd given everything to. They didn't say what it really was, assault dressed up as entertainment for clicks and views. My agency panicked, my supervisor talked about damage control and statements. My phone buzzed with reporters pretending they cared about the truth. I ignored them all. There was nothing to say to people who only wanted a soundbite to fill dead air. Then my father called, his name flashing across the screen like a ghost I thought I'd buried. I answered because some part of me wanted to hear what he'd say when the mask dropped. "You're dragging our name through the dirt," he snapped. Not a hello, not a pause to pretend he cared. "This is attention-seeking, vindictive, beneath you, Rachel. We raised you better than this." I held the phone close enough to feel the heat of his anger, let him spit his poison through the line without interruption. When he ran out of words, I spoke, steady as stone. "I didn't drag anything. I carried that name through the fire while you let it burn me." The pause that followed was long enough to matter. Long enough to feel like an ending. Then he hung up. The next morning, the requests poured in, interviews, statements, the kind of offers that come when people smell blood in the water. I turned them all down and stayed silent because their questions didn't deserve my answers. Instead, I opened a notebook and started writing, first in fragments, then in full sentences, then in policy language sharp enough to cut through the noise. I drafted a bill before sunrise, a protection measure for public servants caught between duty and family loyalty, a shield for people like me who didn't have one when it mattered. It became the Federal Kinship Protection Act, a piece of legislation designed to close the cracks I fell through, built from every scar they left on me. I passed it along to a colleague in the ethics office with no preamble, no explanation, just the work. When I testified before the subcommittee, I spoke without notes, without a script, because the truth didn't need polishing. Some of the worst pressure doesn't come from strangers, I said. It comes from living rooms, from people who raised us, from people who think they own our silence. They didn't ask for names because they didn't need to. They saw it in my eyes, in the way my voice never wavered. The bill passed committee without a single vote against it. The headlines changed overnight. They stopped calling me a scandal and started calling me a reformer, a strategist, someone who turned betrayal into law. Julia came to see me after the dust settled. No cameras, no makeup, just jeans and a jacket, hands tucked into her sleeves like she didn't know what to do with them. I didn't invite her in, but she stepped inside anyway and sat across from me in the chair I kept near the window. "I was jealous of you," she said, before I even understood why. "You were louder without trying, and I hated you for it." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness. I just needed to say it." I leaned back, watching her like I was trying to see the girl I once called sister somewhere in the lines of her face. "You didn't break me," I said. "You just made it easier for everyone else to leave me behind." She nodded, no tears, no defense, just the weight of what couldn't be fixed. When she left, it was as quiet as when she came, and I let her go without watching her walk away. I had work to do. I launched the Witness Line project the following spring, a support network for whistleblowers facing retaliation from their own families, built for the ones who had nowhere to turn. I spoke at its opening in a federal hall filled with people who carried secrets like mine. I told them this wasn't about revenge. It was about protection for those who tried to do the right thing and were left to bleed for it. My mother sat in the back row, rosary in her hand, eyes glassy but dry. She didn't speak. She stayed until the end, and that was enough. My father didn't come. He never called. Julia sent an email the next day, short and simple. Thank you for saying it out loud. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. You were. I read it once and archived it because some things don't need replies. Some truths just need air. And I had more work ahead of me, work they couldn't stop no matter how hard they tried. The storm they tried to unleash on me became the very force I learned to harness for myself because I refused to let their attempts to break me define the person I was becoming every single day. I stopped returning calls from blocked numbers because I already knew they would all sound the same, filled with empty demands and blame disguised as concern. And I stopped reading the articles that pretended to analyze my choices while knowing nothing of the weight I carried alone for years. The world moved forward whether I answered or not, so I chose to keep building what mattered, brick by brick, turning what once felt like wreckage into something that could not be so easily torn apart again. The Witness Line project grew faster than I expected, not because I was anyone special or deserving of the credit, but because the need for it had always existed in silence, waiting for someone to shine a light on it without shame or hesitation. Every month, more people came forward, voices raw with fear at first, but gaining strength as they realized they weren't alone anymore, as they saw the network we had created to catch them where the system failed. I met men and women who reminded me of the girl I used to be, tired but not beaten, scarred but still determined to stand, and together we turned our survival into strategy and our pain into something that could protect others. The press tried to frame me as some kind of savior, but I refused to play along because I knew the truth of pedestals built on shaky ground, and I wasn't interested in their applause or their headlines. One evening, I attended a small private ceremony for new recruits joining the task force I had once served under, and I sat at the back unnoticed, content to watch the next generation take the stage without needing recognition for myself. A young woman at the podium, probably barely out of college, paused in her prepared speech and pointed toward me, her voice steady as she said she had chosen this path because of me, because of the work I had done. For a breath, the entire room seemed to freeze, and I felt the weight of their attention but chose not to stand or wave because I didn't need that moment to validate anything. I simply nodded and let it pass as quietly as it came. Outside, the air was crisp and clear, the hum of the city filling the spaces left behind by the ceremony's end, and I walked home alone, no cameras chasing me, no reporters waiting. Only the peace I had earned and claimed for myself without needing anyone's permission to do so. But peace never stayed long in my life, not really, because peace requires trust, and trust was something I no longer gave freely after everything I had seen and learned. A few weeks later, the message arrived through one of our most secure channels, a message I hadn't anticipated, and it shattered the calm I had briefly allowed myself to believe in. The file that had been marked closed was not closed at all, because Julia's client, the one I had worked so hard to step away from, had never been the true center of the storm. He had been a mask, a distraction, a piece of something deeper and more dangerous that had hidden in the spaces between what we thought we knew. The true architect of the network I had spent years trying to dismantle wasn't the polished man smiling for cameras, wasn't the investors whose names were kept off paper and out of sight, but someone closer, someone inside. Someone who had made sure every effort to bring the operation down failed at just the right time. I stared at the screen so long the words began to blur together, the meaning sinking in slowly like ice water against my skin, and I realized the betrayal I thought I'd left behind in that house with the peeling paint and brittle yard had never really let me go. It had followed me, woven itself into the very work I thought had saved me. The message ended with a name I hadn't heard in years, a name that belonged to someone I had once trusted, someone who had stood beside me when I believed we were fighting for the same cause. Someone who now represented the rot hidden beneath the surface I had dedicated my life to cleaning up. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the file open in front of me, the evidence sharp and undeniable, and I planned my next move with the same precision they had taught me to use when everything was on the line. There would be no rash decisions, no loud confrontations, no calls made in anger. I would take this apart piece by piece, quietly, cleanly, because I owed that much to the people who had trusted me with their stories and their hopes, people who believed I could protect what we built. By morning, I had made my choice. I put on the dark coat I saved for the days when I needed to disappear into the background, when blending in was the most powerful shield I had. I walked to the office as if it were any other day, my step steady, my face calm, and no one stopped me or questioned me, because invisibility was a skill I had mastered better than most. Before noon, I had traced enough threads to see the full scope of what we were really up against. This wasn't just external corruption. This wasn't just a network of criminals hiding behind false names and shell companies. This was betrayal at the heart of what we called justice, sabotage built into the foundation of the cases we thought we were building. And it had been there all along, smiling in meetings, shaking my hand, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew then that the work I had done so far was only the beginning, that what lay ahead would be harder and lonelier than anything I had faced before, but I wasn't afraid. I had already lost everything once and built myself back from the ashes, and I was ready to do it again if that's what it took to finish what I started. That night, I closed the file, turned off the lights, and let the city's quiet hum fill the room as I prepared for the storm I now knew was coming. The storm I had spent so long preparing for arrived without warning, but by the time it did, I was already steady enough to face it without flinching. Every quiet hour I had spent studying files and cross-checking records paid off the moment the first piece of the puzzle fell into place, revealing the extent of the rot hiding beneath polished floors and friendly handshakes. The person I thought was an ally, someone I trusted during the hardest cases of my career, turned out to be the architect behind the delays, the leaks, and the quiet destruction of evidence that haunted every failed prosecution we had tried to build. I didn't run to my superiors or make loud accusations because I knew the danger of drawing attention before the trap was set. Instead, I worked through the night, compiling everything into a single document that told the truth in a language no one could twist or deny. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I didn't stop until the case against them was airtight, built on their own words, their own signatures, their own mistakes. When I was done, I encrypted it, sent it through a channel only a handful of people had access to, and waited for the inevitable fallout. What I didn't expect was the message that arrived just before dawn. A coded note slipped into the system I thought was secure, a message that told me my every move had been watched for longer than I imagined. "You don't know the full story," it said, "but you're about to." I stared at the screen, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt since the night I left home with nothing but a backpack and a name that wasn't mine. I didn't hesitate. I pulled on my coat, grabbed the folder I kept hidden at the back of my drawer, and left before the sun could rise high enough to catch me in its light. I followed the trail they left, because as much as I wanted to believe I was the one holding the map, I knew now I was being led. The meeting point was an empty warehouse on the edge of the city, a place so ordinary no one would have looked at it twice. Inside, the air smelled of dust and forgotten promises, and I found myself face to face with someone I hadn't seen since my early days at the agency, someone I thought had vanished after a botched case in another state. They didn't smile. They didn't offer a greeting. They simply handed me a drive and said, "You need to see what we were really covering up." I took it without a word, because I knew this wasn't the time for questions. Back in my apartment, I locked the door, pulled the blinds, and opened the files that would change everything I thought I understood about betrayal. The network wasn't just a ring of criminals and corrupt officials. It wasn't just dirty money moving through shell companies. It was an operation that reached higher, into rooms where decisions were made that shaped the lives of people who would never know the cost. And Julia's client? He wasn't a kingpin. He was a puppet, a piece meant to fall so that the real players could keep the game going unseen. The twist I didn't see coming wasn't that my agency had been compromised. It wasn't even that the person who trained me had been playing both sides. The real twist was that the operation had been designed from the start to create people like me. People who believed they were hunting monsters when in reality, we were chasing shadows meant to keep us busy while the true architects built power on our backs. I thought I was building protections for others, but in doing so, I helped fortify the walls they hid behind. For days I kept this knowledge to myself, knowing that acting too soon would mean everything we had built would burn with it. I worked quietly, reshaping the witness line project into something stronger, creating hidden redundancies, building private channels that no one could trace without my key. I began documenting the full web of names, dates, and deals that had built the empire we were supposed to be dismantling. Every night I felt the weight of the truth more deeply, but I refused to let it crush me the way they expected it might. Then came the night Julia found me waiting on the courthouse steps, the place where everything had begun to unravel so long ago. I had called her there not because I trusted her, but because I needed her to see what I had uncovered, to understand that the man she had defended was as much a pawn as the rest of us. She listened in silence as I laid out the facts, her face pale, her hands shaking in the dim light of the street lamp that flickered above us. When I finished, she didn't offer excuses or apologies. She only said, "What do we do now?" I smiled for the first time in what felt like years, because that was the right question, the only question that mattered. "We build," I told her. "We build it better, smarter, and stronger so that no one else gets caught in this web without a way out." And together, for the first time in longer than I could remember, we began to plan, not as enemies, not as sisters trying to heal the wounds of the past, but as allies facing a future that no longer felt impossible to change. What no one saw coming, what even I couldn't have predicted, was that the final key to taking down the network wasn't in the files or the recordings or the paper trail I had assembled. The final key was the testimony of someone buried deep inside the operation, someone who had been forced to play both sides just to stay alive. The message came one morning, a single line sent from a burner address. "I'm ready to talk." It was signed with a name I never expected to see again, Grant. In the end, it wasn't just my fight. It wasn't just my story. It was the story of every person who ever tried to do the right thing and found themselves standing alone against the dark. And as I stepped into the morning light, file in hand, ready to face whatever came next, I realized the twist they had hidden from me all along. The only way to win was to stop playing their game entirely, and that was exactly what I intended to do.